This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 10, entitled Consequences of Globa, taken from my second book, entitled Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. Chapter 10, Consequences of Globa. Reading aloud the subtopic headings, which are themselves grouped into 2. The positive consequences. A. Introduction. B. No more wars. C. Cultural expansion. D. Greater wealth. E. Greater happiness. F. Greater fairness. G. Greater knowledge. Negative consequences. H. Introduction. I. Culture side. J. Global boredom. K. Knowledge gap. L. Generation gap. M. Global dictatorship? A. Introduction. This chapter deals with the consequences of the creation of Globa. One obvious consequence, and one of the major reasons for creating Globa in the first place, is to create a world which has no more wars. People should also be a lot happier because they would be living in a culture which is fairer, having fewer injustices, as well as being much wealthier. The creation of Globa will also have some negative consequences, probably the most important one being culture side, that is, the killing off of cultures, as millions of people from small minority inferior cultures adopt voluntarily the norms of the global culture and allow their original cultures to die out. This may not be a bad thing, since everyone is made culturally richer as individuals by the superior richness of the global culture compared to the original single cultures. This phenomenon is called cultural expansion. B. No more wars. The greatest dream of the globist is to live in a world which is free of wars, in which any major political dispute between 2 groups is adjudicated in a world court and not on the battlefield. Wars cause massive human misery. People lose loved ones, people are killed and injured, property is destroyed, people's personalities are embittered, and new hatreds are sown. Wars are terrible. Wars obviously need to be eradicated. The eradication of wars is probably the primary aim of the globists. By creating a global state with a global media, global democratic political parties, a global court, a global police force, a global peacekeeping force, etc., then wars will simply be not allowed, in the same way that many wars inside a nation state are not allowed. If a dispute within a nation state turns violent with the use of firearms, then its National Guard or National Army can intervene and stop it. By analogy, a global military force, GMV, could intervene in a growing dispute between 2 former nations. The dispute would simply not be allowed and be suppressed by a higher power, that is, the global power. With a global media, the citizens of a former nation state would not be brainwashed into a monocultured view by a monocultured media. Instead, if a dispute arose between 2 opposed groups, then the members of both groups would be exposed to the views of the other side, and more importantly, to the views of the rest of the planet. If, for example, the views of a particular group were found to be opposed by the vast majority of groups elsewhere on the planet, then that would be a very sobering experience for the group in question. It would force them to examine their motives and absorb the reasons why most of the rest of humanity is opposed to them, the wisdom of the billions. In a traditional monocultured sovereign nation state, it's quite possible for the leaders to brainwash their citizens into a particular view that may be in the interest of the leaders, but not in the interest of their people, and not in the interest of the other groups of people. With a controlled monocultured media, the mono-citizens get to hear only one viewpoint and become correspondingly narrow in their outlook. So most disputes that may have arisen in the past will simply not get very far in a global state. Most selfish views, as seen by a global majority, coming from a particular group, will quickly be squashed by being considered to be unreasonable by the global majority, and that majority opinion will carry a lot of weight on the world stage. If, however, a dispute is not resolved by the court of world opinion in the world media, then there's always the world court to adjudicate such disputes legally with legally binding decisions. If some group rejects the global court's decisions, then the rest of the planet can resort to tougher measures. The planet could ostracize the offending group. It could oppose a total economic boycott on the group and force compliance. In the limit, it could use the global military, the GMF, to use force. If a traditional nation-state, the concept of sovereignty was virtually sacrosanct, no other nation was allowed to oppose the actions of a given national government towards its own citizens. For example, if the US flew over China and dropped millions of tiny satellite TV receivers and shot down Chinese anti-satellite missiles so that Chinese citizens could be exposed to Western democratic incitements via the US satellites, then the Chinese government would be outraged. It would seem to be an act of war against the Chinese government by the US because the US infringed on Chinese sovereignty. But in a growing mini-Globa, such attitudes will be considered to be increasingly old-fashioned and not be respected. There will be global standards of behaviour, so that ideas such as national sovereignty will be seen as inappropriate. For example, imagine that some group selects a new leader who then increasingly shows signs of becoming somewhat of a dictator and attempts to impose measures on his people. Firstly, this would be very difficult to do because his people will have access to the global media and will be influenced by the views of the rest of the planet. If the new leader becomes massively unpopular due to his dictatorial tendencies, then that planetary disapproval will express itself in the global media, and the people concerned will be motivated to oppose their new leader. But imagine that for some reason the new leader does start to truly oppress his people. Then the rest of the planet could discuss what is happening, and then with a democratic global decision decide to intervene to protect the rights or the very lives of the oppressed people. The claim of sovereign rights of the new leader would simply be ignored and rebuffed by the global majority. In such circumstances, starting a war would be virtually impossible. If that were to be the case, then the primary goal of the globus will have been achieved. C. Cultural expansion. By cultural expansion is meant the idea that individual world citizens, globans, would have their conceptual, intellectual and cultural horizons expanded well above what they were used to in a monocultured existence. The global media, Glow media, would bring them the world. People's horizons would shift from national to global. They would see the planet from a planetary perspective, not from a national and certainly not from a nationalistic perspective. In fact, in such a globalized world, nationalism would be seen as being rather distasteful, provincial, ignorant, blind, bigoted, offensive to other groups, etc. As mentioned in Chapter 7, whenever I see some national leader visiting some other nation and being greeted by a so-called honor guard of soldiers with bayoneted rifles held vertically, I feel disgusted. Such symbols are, in my view, monuments to humanity's intercultural ignorance and incompetence. I hope later in the 21st century, as the world globalizes, that such practices and customs die out and become viewed as being uncivilized, old-fashioned and distasteful. Instead, leaders could be welcomed, for example, by a group of children with flowers, or by leading citizens who represent the values highly regarded by the two nations, etc. Once the minds of millions of citizens are freed from the tyranny of monocultured media, they can then be exposed to the views of the whole planet. Their minds will be hugely expanded. They will start thinking globally and adopt global perspectives. They will become accustomed to seeing more than one point of view in a dispute, when they can hear the views of the opponents, something that is usually not possible with a monocultured media. This exposure to glow media will make globans more tolerant. They will come to question everything with such questions as, well, what does the other side think? Or, what does global opinion think? People will be exposed to the views, habits, customs, etc. of hundreds of different cultures on the global media, and will be free to choose what they want to absorb. With the development of a global language, the media of a given country can be transmitted and understood by the whole planet. Thus, any country distributing programs in the world language will be assured that they will be received by the citizens of the world. In a population of billions, there will always be some people somewhere on the earth who will be watching other countries' programs, especially if they are in the world language. The cultural expansion of the world's citizens will make the cultural homogenization of the planet more likely. It will also increase a sense of global solidarity, making the creation of a global state more probable. Traditional nationalist feeling will die away as people's horizons expand beyond the severe limitations of the nation-state. This is already happening at the time of writing to the Europeans, who have each other's national TV stations coming through the TV cable or by TV satellite. Europeans are becoming less nationalistic and more unionistic. In a manner of speaking, I suppose you could say that if you look upon the EU as a new nation, then the Europeans are becoming more nationalistic, or that they are shifting their nationalisms upwards, that is, shifting to a larger scale of nation. Since I'm largely European in my mentality, despite the 7 countries I've lived in, I was shocked by my first real exposure to American nationalism. Americans are amongst the most nationalistic people on the planet. Admittedly, Americans have some justification for their national pride. They belong to the world's dominant nation. But nevertheless, I felt a real distaste when I saw their nationalistic behaviour for the first time. As I mentioned in a different context in Chapter 7, my first taste of it was as a professor in an American university commencement, that is, graduation ceremony. Student soldiers marched in with the national flag, the national anthem played, the whole crowd stood up like a bunch of robots, put their hands up to their hearts and took the whole thing very seriously. I had come freshly from Brussels, the capital of Europe, which is trying to move beyond the nation-state towards a union of nations. American nationalism I found rather old-fashioned, even dangerous. America's unconscious arrogance, I believe, accounted in large part for President Bush's unilateral invasion of Iraq. Such arrogance is hated by the Arabs, who then slapped Bush's face severely. America lost face throughout the world, and American prestige as a nation reached a new international low. Personally, I believe that American nationalism is so strong that it will take Americans a lot longer to emerge with a mini Globa than the time it will take for other comparably rich nations to merge. Americans will be slow to merge, I believe, because to do so will mean accepting the idea that they are no longer number one. If the Americans merge into a global state, they will become small cogs in a very large machine. That is, Americans will comprise only 5% of the population of the global state. It's therefore likely that Americans will hold on to their self-image as being number one as long as they reasonably can. I predict that Americans will look back on the 20th century as their golden century, that is, when they were top dog, the way the Brits live in the past, thinking about their dominance in the 19th century, or the way the Dutch talk about their gouden eeuw, that is, golden century, in the 18th century, when they were top dog. Nationalism is understandable. It's a deep psychological need of people to have a sense of belonging to a group. But unscrupulous monocultured politicians can manipulate that need in a dangerous fashion, promoting a them and us mentality, and even pushing for war against them. Nationalism is dangerous and not an emotion that ought to be fostered in a global state. Instead, a sense of belonging can be shifted from the nation-state to Globa. Hence we can talk of globalism and someone expressing globalistic feelings. Globalistic feelings are not dangerous because there is no them and us. There is only us, by definition. That is implicit in the very notion of a global state. Those peoples and groups further along the path towards globalization may begin to ridicule the nationalists as being in a more backward level of political development. For example, consider the following deeply held nationalist value, that the greatest sacrifice an individual can make is to die for his country. This sentiment is usually expressed with the literary phrase, "Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his country." Now, of course, soldiers in voluntary armies would not be prepared to die for their country unless they believed that doing so was a great honour. So it's not surprising that monocultured governments foster that attitude. They brainwash their citizens, and especially their soldiers, to believe in such nonsense. The situation is far worse with conscript armies in times of war. Then two opposing sides strongly brainwash their young men to die for their country and to kill the enemy. Personally, I've watched many movies on the First World War in which one sees young men dying like flies, killed by machine gun bullets. These young men were brainwashed to kill each other by their monocultured governments. This mutual brainwashing and the tragedy of seeing millions of conscripts killing millions of conscripts I found utterly sickening, tragic, contemptible. I really hope and expect that once people's cultural horizons have been expanded to the global state, that such monocultured nationalistic brainwashing and especially conscription-based wars will become loathsome phenomena of the past. Thus global cultural expansion will be truly liberating for the world's citizens. They will be freed from the terrors of nationalistic brainwashing and the terrible wars they cause. D. Greater wealth. At the time of writing, the planet spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year on arms. What a waste! We pay a very heavy price, literally, for living in our current state of monocultured ignorance and in a sovereign nation-state system. By creating a global state, all this money would be freed up to be channeled into humanitarian purposes. Poorer countries could see their schools and hospitals improved, their cities given better parks and amenities, more university scholarships could be provided, or education be paid for by the state, aid to poorer countries could be increased, etc. Also, at the time of writing, so many of the world's top scientists and engineers had their talents channeled into weapons research, devising better, more efficient ways to kill people. I can testify to this phenomenon personally. When I was a professor in the US, it was expected of me to get research grants so that the university that employed me could siphon off a percentage of that grant money as a form of university tax to keep the university afloat financially, for example, so it could pay, for example, the heating bills in the winter. The state government in which I was living was paying the state university a smaller and smaller percentage of its bills over the years. The US is the world's largest manufacturer of arms and the greatest exporter of arms to other countries. That is, the US is a cause of mass suffering by supplying the weapons to feed the wars that kill so many people. Since so many billions of dollars go into the manufacture of US armaments every year, this means that there's less money for non-military research. In my research area, that is artificial intelligence, actually artificial brains, 70% of artificial intelligence, AI, research money in the US comes from the military. This is tragic. It means that people like me and their thousands are forced to seek military research money to pay the university tax to keep our jobs. This is a form of military intellectual prostitution, that is, selling our brains to the military for money. In a global state, the US and other so-called major military powers would not have to waste money on armaments manufacture and armaments research. All that money and all those researchers could be channeled towards humanitarian research, increasing the quality of life for millions, if not billions, of people. Investing the money previously spent on armaments in non-military sectors would mean much higher investment rates could be achieved in those sectors. The standard of living would rise proportionately. Instead of paying people to design and build bombs, those people could design and build better houses, buildings, etc., and thus increase the economic growth rate in the manufacture of goods and services that people find truly desirable and useful. In short, people would become a lot richer materially. E. Greater happiness. In a global state, people ought to be a lot happier. They'll be free from the tragedy of wars. They'll be richer due to the rechanneling of money wasted on arms manufacture. They will benefit from the shift away from arms research towards humanitarian research and greater aid levels. At the time of writing, it's 2007, the richest countries have reached a state of mass affluence and whose citizens are now starting to ask themselves about alternatives to material wealth. Many are now complaining about the lack of free time. With both husband and wife in careers, and both being highly educated and qualified, there's often enough money in the household, but not enough time for leisure activities, or to spend more time with the children, or for hobbies. Even rich citizens can be unhappy if their social and psychological sources of happiness are neglected. The US and the UK have recently begun to investigate ways to make people happier, and not simply by making people richer. I live in China, a poor country where virtually all Chinese at all sociological levels have been caught up in the race for money. The Chinese are a proud people who have been the world's dominant culture for millennia, but have fallen far behind the living standards of the Western countries in recent centuries. But now, due to the mass media, hundreds of millions of Chinese have become conscious of the gap between their own living standards and those of the West. They are hungry to catch up, both to become richer and to achieve parity with the West for national ego reasons. Hence, in China at the time of writing, there's a total obsession with money. As a result, for the next few decades, one can expect research into greater happiness levels to be confined to the already rich countries, such as the US and the UK, who share a common language and whose books influence each other, the Anglo-Saxons, as the French call them. Once millions of people feel they have enough money, their attention turns to other pursuits. For example, how to be happier, to be more self-fulfilled, healthier, have better sex, better relationships, better friendships, better marriages, provide better parenting, etc. Scientists are finally turning their attention to such issues and using their scientific method to learn what makes people happier. I would not be surprised that one of the major preoccupations of the 21st century, in the richer countries at least, will be answering questions such as how to make people happier, how to push up GNH, gross national happiness, or rather GGH, gross global happiness. As an example as to how millions of people could be made happier, consider the issue of compatibility in marriage partners. In the US, about 50% of marriages end in divorce, making the divorcees miserable, and the divorced children even more miserable. In many Western countries, marriage as an institution is dying. People simply live together, have their careers, and usually only marry when they have children. In the world's most socially advanced countries, that is Scandinavia, so Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, many couples have children without marrying. The state then marries the couple in the sense that the child becomes the legal responsibility of the two parents, whether they are formally married or not. Amongst couples who live together, the divorce in quotes rate or separation rate is over 80%. I'm not too sure how this statistic is defined. Perhaps the percentage of couples separating who have already lived together for a year? Given the almost universal misery of divorce or separation of couples, what could be done to improve the quality of marriages or partnerships? One obvious answer would be to understand better the nature of marriage compatibility. Why does someone get on better with one person rather than with another? Once scientific answers can be found to such questions, then computers could be used to help search amongst millions of people to find appropriate marriage candidates or friendship candidates, etc. Hopefully then, the failure rates in marriages or friendships will be less. On the other hand, perhaps due to the ease of finding other highly compatible partners, expectations may rise, so that people become a lot more critical of peccadillos and dump partners on the slightest pretext. In one's daily life, one meets or crosses paths with only hundreds of people per month. With a computer database consisting of millions, if not billions of people, each with a list of their personal characteristics and desired characteristics of their prospective partner, it will be possible to pair off people with greater levels of compatibility, provided that science has already taught us what compatibility is, so that it can be measured scientifically and used in computer programs. Similar ideas can be applied to people's free time and to their hobbies. Happiness research ought to be much better funded, so that money and time can be devoted by researchers to understanding the nature of such elusive concepts. If scientific criteria can be created to actually measure a person's happiness level, then statistical samples over a large population could be taken to estimate a nation's happiness level. At a global level, one could imagine a statistic called GGH, gross global happiness, which could give an indication of how happy the planet is. Politicians could then shift their emphasis away from pushing up GNP to pushing up GNH, or from pushing up GGP to pushing up GGH. That is, they would become less interested in economics than personal psychology. They would aim at higher GGH levels than GGP levels. As a result, billions of the world's citizens would become a lot happier. It would not surprise me, considering our current considerable ignorance as to what happiness is and how to measure it, as to what marriage and friendship compatibility is, etc., that our grandchildren may consider our generation to have lived in a truly, psychologically speaking, benighted age. I hope they will be right, implying that our grandchildren will be a lot happier than we are. F. Greater fairness. At the time of writing, the world we live in is massively unfair in the sense that there are great inequalities of wealth and living standards between the peoples of the world. A third of the nations on the planet are not even democracies, so about 2 billion people are not even able to select their own leaders. In a well-developed global state, such unfairness would become a thing of the past. Firstly, all nations would be democratic and subject to a global incomes policy, so that there would not be a large inequality of wealth index, that is, the value of the so-called Gini coefficient, that's G-I-N-I, which measures how evenly distributed income is over a population, would be in the low range, that is around 0.2. A Gini coefficient of 1.0, which is the worst case, is when all the wealth of a population is owned by one person, and a Gini coefficient of 0.0 is when everyone has an equal income. Norway has a highly homogeneous culture which cares for its citizens. It has a Gini coefficient of about 0.2, whereas the US, which is a much less caring culture, has a Gini coefficient of about 0.45. However, the Gini coefficient of the whole planet is a shocking 0.66, using purchasing power incomes, which shows clearly that there are massive income differences between the rich and the poor countries. In a global state, one of the global government's aims will be to narrow the differences, that is, push down the Gini coefficient, by installing progressive taxation on the rich countries and by emphasizing mass education with the latest technologies so that the poor people of the world can pull themselves out of poverty and become productive world citizens with skills resulting from advanced education. Greater knowledge. One of the high priority goals of Globa will be to educate its citizens to a high level, so as to lower the inequalities of wealth and hence create a much fairer world. Chapter 9 presented ideas on how this could be done in practice using a global satellite system called GSL, Global Satellite Learning, and the idea of the Globaversities. And ad-living now, plus use of the internet and its BRAD phenomenon, B-R-A-D, bitrate annual doubling. The internet speed doubles every year. And the use of VPNs, virtual private networks, to get around the firewalls, the censorship of dictatorial governments. And people like myself who are Globicators, who put up for free, to educate the world for free, all the world's knowledge. In my case, I specialize in PhD, master's level pure mathematics, mathematical physics. I put up electronic libraries with links to tens of thousands of full content books, textbooks and so on for the world's students to read for free. Back to the book. In a world free from arms spending and free from the need for military prostitution, it will be possible for the world's best researchers, who previously worked on how to kill people more effectively, to rechannel their creativity towards figuring out ways to educate the planet. Once most of the citizens of the world become well educated, we can expect global economic productivity levels to rise, and hence higher global average incomes. This will be the economic effect, but a greater knowledge level will also have a political